Okay. So, our dear participants, join me as I make welcome our distinguished speaker for today's webinar, Chief Charles Taku. Chief Charles Taku is an experienced professional lawyer before international courts and tribunals. He has over 4 decades of professional experience, 26 years of them in international practice, in international courts and tribunal, international adjudicatory bodies, international dispute settlement mechanisms, counseling, diplomatic practice, and conflict resolution. He's a traditional and cultural leader, a mentor, an advocate for reparations justice for colonial and historical crimes. Chief Takum is a life member of the Governing Council of the African Bar Association and was president of the International Criminal Court Bar Association from 2018 to 2019. On behalf of the International Criminal Bar Association, he addressed the Assembly of State Parties of the Rome Statute during its 20th anniversary and the solemn opening of the International Criminal Court on the 18th of July, 2018. Chief Takum has also appeared as lead counsel at the International Criminal Court in various cases and is also a lead counsel at the Special Court for Sierra Leone. He has also appeared in several other international courts and currently chaired 3 panels of the Legacy Conference of the Special Court for the Sierra Leone. Please join me as I make welcome our distinguished speaker to come and take us through today's topic, which is the pros and cons of the exit of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger from ECOWAS, whose orgs is Gored. Please join me as I make welcome Chief Charles Taku. Chief, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And in all humility, I have to thank the trustees and members of your distinguished association for inviting me to talk on this extremely very important topic that concerns the African continent generally, and the important subject in international law, and also to talk about issues that touch upon the lives of people in a very, very important part of the world. The topic I'm going to talk about today, I've previously written about it in data. I recently published an article in the South African, in the University UNISA, Journal of Comparative International Law of South Africa, on the topic of unconsidered change of government and the legality of the threat of ECOWAS against the use of force against Niger. And but I'm called today to talk on a very, 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 very specific aspect, and that is on the pros and cons of the exit of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger from ECOWAS, whose ox is God. On the 29th January 2025, the Secretariat of ECOWAS issued a statement confirming the effective withdrawal of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso from the organization pursuant to Article 64 of the ECOWAS Treaty. This was a sad end to a crisis that arose from the unconsidered change of government which took place in Niger on the 26th of July 2023, and ECOWAS threat of force to restore the democratically elected government The complementary role of regional arrangements is recognized in Article 52 and 54 of the United Nations Charter. ECOWAS, which was founded on 28 May 1975, is a regional arrangement within the purview of the UN Charter. Until the withdrawal of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, it was an economic union grouping 15 West African countries with the objective of promoting economic cooperation and integration to raise the living standard of its people, maintain and enhance economic stability, foster relations among member states, and contribute to progress among members, to safeguard peace and security in member states. ECOWAS established its protocol relating to the mechanism for conflict prevention, management, resolution, peacekeeping, and security on the 10th of December 1999. The framework of the protocol states that ECOWAS shall support processes towards the restoration of political authority in situations where the authority of government is absent or has been seriously eroded, and that such support may include the preparation, organization, monitoring, and management of the electoral process with the cooperation of relevant regional and international organizations. Pursuant to the framework, the restoration of political authority shall be undertaken at the same time as the development of respect for human rights, enhancement of the rule of law, and the judiciary. ECOWAS leaders in their 62nd session of ECOWAS Assembly, which took place in Abuja, Nigeria on the 4th December 2022, adopted a policy on constitutional changes of government in member states and pledged to enforce stringent measures against violations of the policy. Gil Arnold, writes that ECOWAS was one more African attempt at economic integration, which went further by crossing the boundaries between Anglophone and Francophone countries, as well as embracing the same Lusophone states of West Africa. The objective of the ECOWAS Treaty was to establish a full custom union over 15 years by 1990, a goal which was not achieved. Arnold reasoned that the theory of ECOWAS made sense. If the fragmented West Africa could come together in a working custom union, this would give them greater bargaining power with traditional economic powers in Europe. France was opposed to the formation of ECOWAS and believed correctly that a strengthening of regional ties would reduce French interests in the region. France worked hard to undermine the influence and success of ECOWAS through its colonial treaties and overbearing influence over its independent African neo-colonial states. To France, they were independent but not free. France determined the economic policies, monetary system, security architecture, and diplomatic orientation. ECOWAS was not completely free of French influence. The political conflict in Côte d'Ivoire demonstrated this. France funded and dominated the UN-endorsed Operation Licorne, ceasefire operation, which ECOWAS was supposed to oversee in collaboration with the French military. This continued under French command, even after the UN eventually took over responsibility, ultimately serving French interests rather than ECOWAS objectives. Adebayo draws attention to a valid argument often made by critics that Operation Licorne was just another case of French sending troops to pacify the natives, and that as a former colonial power, France had important human, material, and symbolic investments to protect in the country. Critics viewed Lincoln as another instance of old-fashioned French military intervention, the entire Ivorian Air Force was decimated by France when militants killed 9 French soldiers in Bouaké on the orders of then French President Chirac. I will, because of the constraint of time that may come, answer a question that this topic elicites very clearly. And permit me to read my prepared remarks. The threat of the use of force by ECOWAS against Niger was a violation of international law. There's no doubt about that. It was a violation of the UN Charter. It was a violation of the African Constitution Act, Article 4, the UN Charter, Article 2.4. But the unconstitutional change of government was not new, was not a new development. It didn't start with Niger. ECOWAS, from its inception in 1975, had lived under the reality with unconstitutional change of government in Nigeria, in Ghana, in most of the French West African colonies, what we called the cool belt in Africa, and in some of the Eastern countries. The only country that was insulated from this might have been Senegal. Indeed, at the time that ECOWAS forces led by Nigeria went into Sierra Leone, the government of Nigeria was under the dictatorship of Abacha, meaning that the constitutional change of government, as it were, was not a new development. And therefore, the threat of the use of force against Niger in order to restore the democratic elected government of President Bazoum was in violation of the ECOWAS treaty. The African Union, in reaction to that coup, took a resolution that is to be resolved through diplomatic means. Sanctions were legitimate under the ECOWAS treaty, under the AU Constitutional Act and the United Nations. Indeed, they imposed, they suspended Niger and other countries, Burkina Faso and Mali and Guinea, for the organizations. But coercive measures that were implied, including economic blockade by Nigeria and the other countries, were manifestly illegal. Coercive measures could only be imposed by the Security Council or the authority of the Security Council. Indeed, the operations of ECOWAS in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Cote d'Ivoire were endorsed by the United Nations Security Council, and they were not coercive measures as such. There were peacekeeping operations, peace monitoring operations, and indeed, ECOWAS had been a leader in such operations in the world because they stabilized and they limited the human suffering in these countries, even though in the case of Sierra Leone, under the leadership of Liberia, under the leadership of General Victor Malu, ECOWAS committed certain crimes which ECOWAS were looking into, but that did not undermine the peacekeeping objectives of ECOWAS, and it was within their mandate to intervene in those operations, the military operations. But The conclusion I drew, which I will before I answer whose ox is to grow, I answer the question about whose ox is God, is that despite the unconstitutional change of government in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, and the illegality of the threat of the use of force against Niger, the overall ECOWAS made commendable frantic attempts and sacrifices to carry out humanitarian interventions, ceasefire monitoring interventions, and the enforcement of peace mandates, which were endorsed or determined by the United Nations Security Council in conflict situations in member states of Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Cote d'Ivoire. ECOWAS intervention prevented war, enforced the peace, forced warring parties to the peace table, protected civilians in armed conflict, opened safe humanitarian corridors for civilians and victims to seek refuge in safe places for humanitarian assistance to be delivered to victims, and contributed significantly to peace and security in West Africa. By the threat of the use of force, in violation of the ECOWAS founding treaty and its revised treaty protocol, as well as the African Union Constitutive Act and UN Charter, the withdrawal of membership by Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso due to harm caused by these violations is a temporary setback, which may be redressed by the fact that they share common economic interests, geographical proximity, ethnicity, socio-cultural and political aspirations, historical backgrounds, and ideological goals. The fight against colonialism and neocolonialism requires unity and not a split, which would only advance the colonial and neocolonial agenda the parties are united in their resolve to fight against. For this reason, ECOWAS and the Alliance of the Sahel States should secure all forms of disagreement and develop new forms of cooperation for their collective survival in the face of dire security and economic challenges in the new world order. It is my understanding that all the countries, constituting countries of ECOWAS, as well as those of the Sahel, they face the same threat. They are all victims. The dire security and economic challenges faced by Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali are the same existential crisis faced by the rest of the ECOWAS countries. Indeed, the very foundational principles, goals, objectives of ECOWAS were to fight against these challenges. It was within the power of ECOWAS to harness its resources and its peace and security and its security architecture in order to support the fight against terrorism, economic challenges that the Saharan countries were facing. But then, the very challenges, existential crisis, were hampered by the fact that on the territory of Niger, you had French and American military bases. The presence of the military bases of the United States and France in the territory of Niger were in violation of the African Charter, the Preamble of the Charter, outlawed the presence of military bases on the continent of Africa. And therefore, the very presence of France and its military bases in Niger, and those of the United States, were actually a direct affront, a direct threat to the existential objectives of ECOWAS, indeed of Africa. It was against the very soul of the peace and security on the African continent, because these were destabilizing forces that encouraged and energized the security threats rather than fight against them. An example, the weapons that were found in the hands of the rebels or so-called terrorists across the Mediterranean to the Sahara Desert to West Africa to Nigeria and the rest of the countries, 47% of these weapons were said to have come from France. And the flow of money within the economic union, the flow of money in the hands of these groups came from Western countries, the very Western countries that control the very monetary reserves, the financial reserve, the currency of many of the ECOWAS countries. Their currencies, which are supposed to be guaranteed by the reserve from the French treasury. In other words, they lacked much of ECOWAS country, lacked economic sovereignty, lacked sovereignty over their own finances, and lacked the sovereignty over their economic policies that contradicted the very objectives, the foundational objectives of ECOWAS. In other words, the challenges which Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali faced and still face today, and that led to the split, are the very challenges that the rest of the ECOWAS countries are still facing today. And therefore, they are victims. It is just the degree and the disagreement that have been caused and the confusion that have been caused leading to this split. And this split is a direct challenge to the very soul of the liberation and independence and economic prosperity and unity of Africa. Take note, ECOWAS as it is, was a very bold attempt at African unity to finding Lusophone countries, Anglophone countries, and the Francophone colonies coming together in economic union. Despite the fact that some of these countries were still linked to the former colonial countries by subsisting colonial treaties that deprived them of their full independence. Take note that the French colonies, in granting independence, they were still bound by the objective and the treaty obligations of the Roi Cadre of 1956. That France promised to give the independence, but they were still under that law, Roi Cadre, they were still linked to France by these security, colonial treaties, cultural treaties, economic treaties, and therefore the independence was not complete. And then they graduated into independence and faced the Cold War, that the ghost of the Cold War is still afflicting this economic bloc and most of Africa. And now the current world trend, the new world order that evolved, has even put much of ECOWAS countries and Africa in a dire situation. With the evolving situation in the Middle East, the maritime economy, the maritime economy and the maritime security in the Middle East, the Gulf of Guinea has taken another importance. And therefore, the activities of these colonial powers in the Gulf of Guinea, and by the Gulf of Guinea, you understand that the maritime economy in the Gulf of Guinea, the transportation, shipping, and the maritime security in the Gulf of Guinea is no longer in control of ECOWAS countries or African countries. And therefore, the peace and security architecture is still very much in control of the colonial powers. And therefore, how will the African economies, the ECOWAS countries, how will they survive if they did not come together? If they do not look for different forms of cooperation with the Sahelian countries, the new challenges that we face in the Sahel migration challenges, the criminal conduct of the killing, massacre, extermination of young African migrants in the Mediterranean, that is from Nigeria, from the Gambia, from over the continent, makes the silent country the gateway to this part of the world. Therefore, the security apparatus of the silent countries at that of much of ECOWAS is still in the hands of ECOWAS. And therefore, the African leaders in ECOWAS must look for another way of constituting themselves as that the obligation for them to come together and again review and bring about reforms and forge ahead with the founding objective of ECOWAS, irrespective of what forms it takes, irrespective of the fact that there are many other competing treaty obligations, bilateral treaties linking the countries and the different countries. For example, we have the multilateral force fighting Boko Haram within the ECOWAS by linking Nigeria and other countries, Cameroon, Chad, which are not members of ECOWAS. We have the Lake Chad Basin Commission that has its own security architecture, linking these other countries who are not members. And you have the insecurity in the Gulf of Guinea and the Southern Cameroon problems, which now again aggravate a lot of tension within the Gulf of Guinea, begging for the sub-regional organizations in order to sit together and to see exactly how they can bring peace and security in this region. If not so, the ECOWAS, and perhaps what they call the Central African state, is a boiling pot that might explode and for conflagration and affect the entire continent beyond its borders. We have other challenges, the new world trends and the new challenges. Is bolstered by the fact that in 1945, when they established the United Nations Charter, it was never contemplated that non-state actors will play a key role in international relations. Today have terrorism. Today we have multilateral corporations. But it is no doubt to Africa that even when the United Nations Charter was, even after the United Nations Charter, Africa was still not free. Colonialism continued. Africans were never subject to international law. The situation has not changed. Africa is not yet in control full of the economy. And therefore, for me, in particular, the existence of these former colonial masters or colonial masters, which still consider Africa as new colonies, is that the ECOWAS country, economic zone, they have to fuel instability, the instability, in order to justify their continued presence of enforcing their security arrangement, bilateral and multilateral security arrangements, so that it can be paid for by the mineral resources of these African countries, the petroleum resources, the uranium, and here the gold. Of course, the amount of resources in Zamfara state of Nigeria alone, if it were left to be exploited by the Nigerians themselves for Nigeria, it could change the economic outlook of Nigeria. Yet, in the midst of these challenges, how could ECOWAS, how could Mali, how could Burkina Faso, how could they be fighting against terrorism when the terrorists continue to kill and decimate their soldiers, and yet not a single French soldier, not a single American soldier who were there to help them to fight against terrorism, not a single one of their military was ever affected or attacked. So it is for ECOWAS at least to again perhaps establish another summit and engage in meaningful dialogue with the Saharan countries, at least to support them and to support itself to provide the security for its own population. The African Union had done the appropriate thing by appointing the president of Burundi, President Evariste Ndayishimiye, as its envoy to the Saharan countries in order to start dialogue with African Union, in order to see about what African Union can do realistically to assist these countries and to help them to a step towards democracy, but also to help them towards the security challenges so you can find African solutions. ECOWAS needs to abandon the belligerent threats, architecture, policies, and engage in dialogue with the friendly people of the Sahel in order to also see that the founding objectives of ECOWAS, which will have been celebrating its 50th anniversary in May, is instead made in a division and this conflict. For me, Africa loses. The also is people Africa. And I cannot even endanger how, if there were to be a threat of attack on Niger, how it's not going to affect a greater population, will put the whole continent on fire. Because on that particular bed is a factor of ethnicity that we see in all armed conflict in Africa will play, and the same colonial masters will supply the weapon and the arms in order to purport to bring stability when I find the conflict. These African countries do not produce weapons. The rebels or the terrorists do not manufacture weapons. And we'll have operating protocols. We'll have the Abuja protocol on the proliferation of small weapons and the United Nations Convention on Proliferation of Small Weapons. They have never been enforced. So with French soldiers and American soldiers in Niger, how did these weapons get into the hands of these terrorists? What were they doing there? So it means that the instability, the disintegration of ECOWAS benefited either the multinationals, either these neo-colonial forces, or what we call the war economy, in which the resources of these countries, the uranium and others, are paid. They loot them in order to pay for security, which they never achieve. Independence we never achieve. Economic prosperity they never achieve. And indeed, it is argued in the Sahelian countries of Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, that what occurred is not a considered change of government, it's a revolution. And there's some merit to this because these countries were never truly independent as such to have talked about unconstitutional change of government because of the war card. If you have a country that they have colonial treaties controlling the economy, controlling the currency, and controlling key sovereignty aspects of the government, and the country is unstable, and if some citizens take up arms in order to try to protect their people, it is difficult, really, to say constitutional change of government. And by and large, the ECOWAS Treaty did not actually define what constitutes the constitutional change of government. It's the African, the AU Protocol of 2000, Algiers Declaration, that defined the constitutional change of government to include the change of term limits for people to stay in power in perpetuity, manipulation of the constitution, corruption. But ECOWAS that did not, it was very, very restricted. So the constitutional change of government definition of terrorism, and all, but they're still nebulos, they're still amorphous constructs. And therefore, we must go back to the drawing board. The founding principles are correct. They are still relevant today. ECOWAS is still relevant. I do not really see any other regional peace, security, and economic architecture that will replace ECOWAS. Indeed, in the whole continent of Africa, ECOWAS is still very, very relevant. Just that we need to go back and adjust and have this debate. And I think this webinar, I think your center, by bringing this up, this debate will continue so that ECOWAS can be rescued, the founding principle of ECOWAS. We can get back to the founding principle of ECOWAS and engage in dialogue. Africa, ECOWAS must own its problems. We cannot run away. The country will decide, yes, this security challenge, but that is not the end of the matter. We'll fight and fight and fight, but there's no replacement, no other architecture that will replace the founding principle of ECOWAS. I think I will leave it at that and I'll invite questions. I do not know whether I've been coherent enough because I'm talking from a larger problem that I've explored. But I think my understanding is that who also is God, it is that the fight, the problem is that it's for the soul of West Africa. So soul, this is a struggle, the fight for the existential soul of the West African countries, of ECOWAS, of the Sahelian countries, of the people of Africa, of people of African origin, and that this is just the tip of the iceberg. The worst is still to come, because had ECOWAS attacked Niger, who will benefit? The French. They have been doing that just like the Ivorian, the Lecon, Operation Lecon. The France came there initially to say they came there for the possibility to protect French citizens. French citizens have been killed, and they ended up decimating the Ivorian Air Force. They ended up killing and looting and abducting Babo and carrying him to the ICC, a case that collapsed on the merit. Had ECOWAS attacked Niger, that would have been the fighting, the battleground would have been in Nigeria. The fighting ground would have been Ghana. The battleground would have been Burkina Faso, would have been Togo. To the benefit of whom? The people, France, probably the United States. And how come it that the uranium, the petroleum resources in the southern Cameroon, in the Niger Delta, in the rest of West Africa, in the Gulf of Guinea, the maritime economy in the Gulf of Guinea, how come Africa is not in control of this? How come is that the colonial treaty, multilateral and bilateral treaty framework, it sees so much unbalance that African countries, ECOWAS, and the other African countries are still beggars? How come it that the ghost of colonialism is still, as we talk, dominating? How come it that the currency, foreign currency, of course, Nigeria, Ghana, and some of the countries have their own currency. That is a good beginning, no matter the challenges we have. But how come it that the economic reserve, the financial reserve is still in French banks? What sort of sovereignty is that? So ECOWAS was actually, the soul of ECOWAS under constant attack. The foundational objective was under constant attack by the French and the French economy and mercenary economic interests, which we must resist, and ECOWAS must go back to the drawing board, and we talk. The people in the Niger, this alliance of our brothers, the Africans, there is no way we can escape from our own shadow. The objectives there, we should support them economically and allow them to use our ports, allow them to use, how can we, the energy bilateral treaty arrangement between Niger and Nigeria over the years. Suddenly, they had to block medicine and others getting to Niger in order to support a neo-colonialist ideology of economic blockade of Niger, which is inconsistent with ECOWAS treaty framework and the protocol, which says yes, you can intervene in terms of by sanctions, by helping them to establish the constitutional order, by helping them to meet their security needs, but not to cripple the country. And in any case, the type of starvation that I'm seeing in the other part of the world, you see the use of starvation by economic blockade is against the ICC, the Rome Statute, for which Nigeria is a state party, heaven's sake. Benin Republic is a state party. Togo is a state party. The use of starvation, just like what is happening in Gaza, the use of starvation to extent it can constitute genocide. How did this idea, for whose interest? To punish your own people? No. Even in humanitarian intervention means is that you should supply the resources. It was ill-conceived, it was wrong, but the reaction of this country by splitting and hoping to think that ECOWAS is the enemy is wrong. ECOWAS is not the enemy. ECOWAS is a victim because the same type of violation of neo-colonialist attacks, proliferation of weapons to attack and destabilize the Sahelian countries is the same. It is the same. The financial sector and everything is the same onslaught which is going on in each of African countries as we talk today. If you ask them, they will say nothing. Nigeria has nothing. But Zamfara State, look at the resources. Zamfara State alone, I'm just quoting just one. Look at the Niger Delta. Look at the Southern Cameroons. Why is there 9-year war in Southern Cameroon today? It's because of this individual. What has Cameroon Republic got to gain by exterminating more than 40,000 people of Southern Cameroon? What have they got to gain? Does the petrol belong to? No. Does this petrol resources? This economy is multinational. So when we talk about terrorism, yes, but we also see that terrorism is not just these armed bands that are giving weapons to kill and exterminate civilians in a decimate and destabilize economies in order to have access to the economic and mineral resources to pay for security protection that they don't give. We should also look at the conduct of multilateral corporations. Look at the maritime economy, fishing rights, the navigation rights across the Gulf of Guinea. Where are the treaty regimes? When Iran tried to block the maritime transportation, they turned to the Gulf of Guinea, which is a no man's land to them. So what do we get from that? So for me, it's a matter being in international court and tribunals, uninterrupted, all of them for these 26 years, on a daily basis. I cry and weep for Africa. And I think your center has done a great thing by bringing this debate. Let this not be the last. We should hold on our leaders. ECOWAS has made giant strides. ECOWAS has the ECOWAS court, for heaven's sake. A legal framework which we should insert in power and give them resources, and the decisions should be enforced. And the authority of head of states should fight against the manipulation of constitutions to prolong people, make elections which are sham elections in order to perpetuate individuals in power, term limits, remove them, and it design a class of neo-colonialist puppets who are just there. And also for ECOWAS, we talk about corruption within ECOWAS. Who are the people who negotiate investment contracts in ECOWAS free zone? Do you find African experts there? Who are the people who put ouster clauses in investment contracts in terms of any conflict? None of the African court or even the ECOWAS court has no jurisdiction. This should be negotiated in Europe. So these investment contracts are the hallmark of corruption, the worst ever. because they intended to enforce new colonialist economic policies. And therefore, realistically talking, from the inception of ECOWAS has never peace. African countries, the ECOWAS zone, have never been, in reality, the country has never been had the peace of mind. Either through coup d'etats, either through unconsidered change of government, either through economic policies, and especially, and what are most provocative, they have no control over their own currency, their own economic policies, their educational policies. And somebody told me that history is no longer taught in Nigerian school. If you cannot teach history, the history of your own, so it is just extreme. And books are banned, that people are no longer. So your center has undertaken a mandate, which I do not know that after this webinar and many others, I do not know whether you will be allowed to operate, but permit me to raise my case and to thank you sincerely. Maybe there may be questions. If there are no questions, maybe this debate will continue. And maybe my perspective may not be accepted. But I'm saying because I've been seeing rare cases, being in the situation in Darfur, situation in South African Republic, the situation, the Tribunal for Rwanda, the Special Court for Sierra Leone. In the Special Court for Sierra Leone, for example, people were jailed because of the diamonds, but not a single. The diamonds, people died for over 10 years. Where did the diamond go to? Who supplied the weapons for this? So the ECOWAS only came in Sierra Leone, and ECOWAS to try to look for a solution. Even though ECOWAS soldiers also committed crimes, yes. But the overlying factor in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and in Cote d'Ivoire was to attempt to stabilize these countries, but in the battlefield where ECOWAS and in the Lomé Peace Accord and the conference, the boardrooms of diplomacy and the battlefields, you see have French soldiers. Even in Liberia, when they put sanctions on Charles Taku, the French gave him diplomatic support and allowed weapons to flow freely to Charles Taku. So the ghost of colonialism is still there. I must talk about it and talk about it. If only giving me this platform to talk about this, I thank you sincerely. And I think this conversation will continue. I do not know whether what I've said makes sense, but if it didn't make sense, nevertheless, I thank you for your listeners that I'll be able to say some of these things and that this debate will continue. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Chief. Thank you. Thank you. What you said made a lot of sense. You know, this lecture is quite elaborate, and you will see the way we receive this lecture through our questions and further interactions that will follow suit. But first of all, I would like to invite Professor Enabulele. Thank you, Mike.